In this video, we're going to focus on reptiles. As you may recall from the video on amniotes, there were kind of two main evolutionary lines. There was the synapsids, which includes the therapsids, which evolved into mammals. But the one that we're going to focus on here is the sauropsid line, which evolved into diapsids, which evolved into reptiles. And then within the reptiles, there are kind of two additional groupings. There are the Archosauromorpha, and that word roughly translates to ancient lizard form. And it includes the crocodilians and also birds and extinct dinosaurs. The Lepidosauromorpha translates to scale lizard form, and it includes the modern snakes, lizards, and tuataras. So looking at our phylogenetic tree, we are taking a look at our reptiles, and we're going to focus on turtles, snakes, and crocodiles. We'll talk about birds in their own video. And remember, they are amniotes. They are tetrapods, so they have 4 legs. They have lungs. They have a jaw. They have a vertebral column. They are chordates, and they are deuterostomes. So taking a look at the general characteristics of reptiles, they are tetrapods, which means that they have 4 legs. There are some limbless reptiles, so reptiles that don't currently have 4 legs. So for example, a snake doesn't have any obvious legs, but they likely evolved from a tetrapod ancestor. So basically they had legs at one point, and then due to evolution, they eventually lost their legs. Reptiles do reproduce sexually with internal fertilization, so the male has to deliver sperm into the female reproductive tract. And they lay eggs on land, so even aquatic reptiles such as sea turtles have to come on shore in order to lay their eggs. And their eggs are different from chicken eggs in that they have this calcareous or leathery eggshell, and this helps to give the shell a little bit of flexibility. And one reason why this is important, so I have worked with sea turtles in the past, and a sea turtle can lay on average about 120 eggs at a time in one nest. And they dig a hole that's potentially a foot or more in depth. So you can imagine if you took 120 chicken eggs and you dropped them 1 foot into the sand, they would all break. And that's because their shells are rigid. But these kind of leathery eggshells allow them to fall on top of each other without breaking. Another characteristic of reptiles is that they do have scales on their skin. And you can see that on this picture of a tortoise here. You can see the scales here. And these scales help to provide adaptations for reptiles to be able to live on land. So the scales in the skin have keratin, which remember keratin is a tough and waterproof protein. It also has waxy lipids, and lipids are hydrophobic. One trade-off to having this kind of waterproof skin is that they cannot breathe through their skin. So remember, amphibians can exchange gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen across their wet skin, but reptiles don't have that ability. Instead, they have to breathe air, and they do have lungs. Reptiles are ectotherms or ectothermic, which means that kind of the more common term is cold-blooded, but ectotherm is the more appropriate term for how they thermoregulate. And so what this means is that heat comes from the environment. So if we take a look at like a human, okay, so as humans, we are endothermic, meaning that when we get cold, our body can do things to produce heat to try to warm us back up. So for example, when you're cold, your body starts to shiver, and as your muscles are contracting, they give off heat as a way to bring your body temperature back up. But reptiles don't have that ability, so they are very dependent on the temperature of the environment. So there are some advantages to this because they don't have to burn nutrients to generate heat. And that means that reptiles need maybe about 10% of the calories required by a same sized endotherm. So they don't have to eat nearly as much as a human, given if they were the same body size as a human. There are some behavioral adaptations that they have to regulate their temperature. So they can bask, and that means that they can go basically lay in the sun. They might find shade or dig a burrow or find a burrow to hide in. This is especially common in like desert reptiles. And then some of them do something called brumation. And brumation is kind of similar to hibernation, but physiologically it is different. So in hibernation, an animal is asleep and they are basically living off of their fat reserves until they wake up. In brumation, the reptiles are not asleep, they're just kind of in this slowed state of metabolism. So their metabolism slows way down, so they're not very active, but they're not technically asleep. Dinosaurs were the dominant reptile on Earth until about 65 million years ago. And evolutionary evidence indicates that they are more closely related to modern day birds and crocodilians, which includes alligators, than other reptiles. So we usually think of dinosaurs being closely related to lizards, but in reality, they are more closely related to birds and crocodiles and alligators than they are to lizards or turtles. And this is a funny meme here. So, disappointing moments in evolution, and it shows a dinosaur here, and then 65 million years later, it's showing a turkey. The other ones on this meme, so this is a platypus, and you'll see that the platypus basically hasn't changed. And then this one shows a crocodile, and this is a croc shoe. So if we look at the taxonomic classification of reptiles, so we've already kind of covered these levels here. So domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and subphylum Vertebrata. And remember, the subphylum Vertebrata includes things like amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals. So we are now focusing in on this class, Reptilia, and that's at this level right here. And then kind of between class and order, we have these subclasses. And we have these 4 subclasses that we're going to talk about on the next couple slides. So we have subclass Crocodilia, Sphenodonta, Squamata, and Testudines. So the subclass Crocodilia includes crocodiles, so that should make sense. It also includes alligators and caimans. And caimans are just animals that look a lot like alligators and crocodiles. They live in the tropic and subtropic areas around the world. We do get alligators here in South Carolina. I know they're up in North Carolina and maybe into Virginia. They are much more common the further south you go, so they're really common in places like Florida. They're also common in like Central and South America. And depending on the species, they can live in freshwater, saltwater, or brackish water. And brackish is just kind of an intermediate or a mix of salt and freshwater. So it's not as salty as, say, the ocean, but it's not freshwater. You often find this in places where freshwater rivers meet up with saltwater seas, and then the water kind of mixes. Subclass Sphenodontia includes the Tuatara, which is shown in this picture here. There are two extant, and extant means currently living. So it's the opposite of extinct. So there are two extant species, and they are found in New Zealand. Subclass Squamata includes lizards and snakes, and they are found on all continents except for Antarctica. And even though snakes and lizards are classified together, there are some differences between the two. So lizards, most of them have 4 limbs, whereas snakes have lost those limbs. There are some exceptions. There are some lizards out there that look like snakes that don't have those limbs. Lizards also have eyelids and external ears, whereas snakes do not have eyelids and they do not have external ears. And then subclass Testudines are going to be our turtles. They have a bony or cartilaginous shell that's part of their skeleton. So it's interesting, a turtle cannot leave its shell because the shell is actually part of its skeleton. And if you were to look at the inside of a turtle shell, the vertebral column, the vertebrae, are actually attached to the inside of the shell. The belly part of the shell, so this underneath part here, is known as the plastron. And the back shell is known as the carapace. And as I mentioned, that carapace, that shell, is actually part of the ribs. So the ribs are attached. It's like bone attached to bone that makes up the shell. Now, within the testudines, you might hear some different kind of terminology talking about the different types. So the word turtle is kind of a catch-all phrase. So technically it includes any of these animals that have these shells, basically. But some people more specifically just call sea turtles turtles. So sometimes when they say turtles, they're really talking about the marine turtles. And these marine turtles, remember, marine just means that they're found in salt water, so they live in the ocean. And they're sometimes also just called turtles, and they have flippers as their feet. Terrapins are also known as freshwater turtles, and they have webbed feet. And then tortoises are terrestrial turtles, and they have a more domed shell because they don't have to worry about being kind of hydrodynamic. So just to recap, turtles includes all of these. So turtles include sea turtles, freshwater turtles, and terrestrial turtles. But more specifically, freshwater turtles are known as terrapins, and terrestrial turtles are known as tortoises.